Welcome to our channel, where history meets truth beyond the maps drawn by empires. In this series, Correcting History, Ghana's Map and DNA Explained, we journey through centuries to uncover how borders, migrations, and genetic revelations reshape our understanding of Ghana's identity and ancient heritage. Correcting History, How Ghana's Map and DNA Reveal the Truth of its Origins. Part 1. Before the Borders, the Land That Breathed History. The land that would one day be called Ghana was never still. It shifted, breathed, and transformed beneath the feet of countless generations long before any border was drawn or flag planted. Millennia before the notion of a nation, the region stretched like an endless tapestry of green forest, rolling savanna, and silent gold rivers that glittered under the watchful gaze of the sun. Ancient rains carved valleys, and dry winds swept across the Sahel, weaving stories in dust and stone. Here, communities were born not from ink on maps but from rhythm and soil, farmers who bent with the millet, hunters who followed the shadows of elephants, and traders who traced paths from the edge of the Sahara to the sea's shimmering mouth. The early ancestors who walked this land spoke in the languages of kinship and sky. They saw no lines dividing their world, only routes that led to exchange, ceremony, and survival. Each migration carried whispers of memory, of rivers that fed their cattle and forests that offered kola nuts, of the sacred baobab whose roots were said to touch the spirits of the ancestors. As centuries unfolded, waves of peoples flowed through this land like living rivers, the Gur from the north, the Akan from the east, the Moldagbani from the savannas, and the Garadangbe from the coastal plains. Their movements were not invasions but interweavings, each culture bringing with it songs, technologies, and rituals that shaped the land's soul. The forest kingdoms began to rise, marked by the iron clang of forges and the hum of trade routes alive with salt, gold, and kola. The heart of this world pulsed with connection. From the grasslands of Mali to the Atlantic shores, roads unseen by outsiders carried not only goods but ideas, the notion of community, of divine kingship, of balance between earth and spirit. The early empires of Ghana, not the modern nation but the ancient Sonic kingdom far to the northwest, inspired the idea that wealth could be drawn from earth and organized into glory. The people of the lands that would later form Ghana watched as caravans glittered with gold dust under the desert sun, and word spread of the land of gold, a myth that would one day shape maps and lure strangers across oceans. But even as fame spread, the Real story lay deeper, in the daily rhythms of local kingdoms like Bono, Manso, and Tekamon, whose artisans shaped metal into art and whose rulers governed through councils bound by ancestral law. These early states, bound by kinship and trade, were built not upon conquest but on negotiation and faith, the belief that land belonged to the living and the dead alike. As centuries turned, the rivers changed course and trade paths shifted. What had once been the edge of an empire became the heart of another. The Akan states emerged from this transformation, carving identities from gold and lineage, where stools symbolized both political authority and the weight of spiritual inheritance. Oral traditions carried through the centuries told of migrations from the Old North, of leaders guided by dreams, of wars fought not only for land but for memory. Every clan held a story of arrival, and every shrine guarded a truth older than the spoken word. Long before any European hand shaped its geography, this land was already mapped, not in lines but in meanings. Rivers marked paths to ancestors, mountains were the resting places of spirits, and groves stood as living temples. Boundaries were drawn through kinship, through marriage, and through shared sacrifice. One could cross a territory by offering a blessing, not a passport. This spiritual mapping made Ghana's early world both vast and intimate, expansive in its trade and diplomacy, yet bound by a shared respect for the unseen. The knowledge systems of this time were intricate. Astronomy guided planting seasons, oral historians preserved dynasties through praise poetry, and elders read omens in wind and flame. These traditions formed the first architecture of identity, where territory meant belonging, and belonging meant responsibility. To lose one's land was to lose one's ancestors, to betray them was unthinkable. And yet, change always whispered on the horizon. Migrations continued, mixing bloodlines and languages, expanding cultural mosaics. By the dawn of the 14th century, the distant echoes of Islamic scholarship began to reach the northern frontiers. Caravans brought not only goods but books, and with them new ways to measure time, land, and lineage. The oral became written, the sacred became mapped, and slowly, an invisible transformation began, a movement toward a world that would one day divide what had always been whole. But in this pre-colonial dawn, the land still belonged to itself. Every stream, every path, every gathering under a tree carried history far deeper than any empire could imagine. And when future explorers would come with their compasses and charts, believing they were the first to define this space, they would never realize that they were merely tracing over a living map drawn by millennia of human hands, hearts, and migrations. The story of Ghana's map, then, did not begin with a border. It began with breath, with footsteps pressed into red soil, and with the eternal dialogue between people and place. Part 2. The Kingdoms of Gold, Power, Trade, and the Birth of Boundaries. Gold did not simply shimmer in Ghana's soil, it ruled it. Long before the first European sails pierced the western horizon, the veins of gold that laced the forests and rivers had already woven together empires and destinies. The kingdoms that rose across this land were not accidental. They were born from the gravitational pull of wealth and the human hunger for influence. Bono, Denkyera, and later Ashanti emerged as shimmering centers of trade, diplomacy, and artistry. Their cities resonated with the clang of goldsmiths' hammers, the hum of markets, and the rhythmic chants of royal processions. The land pulsed with life, and each kingdom learned that to control trade was to control fate. The Akan confederacies were not empires of tyranny but networks of mutual obligation and shared prosperity. Kings ruled through consensus, advised by councils of elders, priests, and queen mothers who embodied ancestral wisdom. Their gold weighed not only in commerce but in ceremony, its sanctified authority, binding rulers to the will of their ancestors. Tribute systems linked small settlements to grand capitals, and the exchange of goods became the lifeblood of diplomacy. Gold flowed northward to the Sahel, while salt and cloth streamed south, a continuous pulse of exchange that mirrored the heartbeat of the continent itself. But wealth, as always, attracted distant eyes. Across the desert, the echo of Ghana's riches reached the ears of North African traders, then to Andalusian scholars, and finally to the Portuguese, who dreamed of reaching the source of this endless gold. When in the 15th century their caravels landed on the coast, they named it the Mina, the mine, for here, they believed, lay the treasure of legend. Yet the Europeans did not discover gold, they merely stumbled into the middle of a civilization already thriving upon it. The locals knew its worth not as greed but as gift. Gold adorned the sacred stools of kings and the graves of ancestors, never treated as mere metal but as the very breath of the earth. The arrival of Europeans altered not only trade but perspective. They began to draw, measure, and chart, to impose lines where none existed. Portuguese fortresses like Elmina rose as stone sentinels of ambition, their cannons watching the tides as if guarding the future. The coastline, once a realm of open exchange, began to close under monopoly. Trade routes that had stretched like arteries inland now pulsed toward foreign ships. Yet even as the Europeans mapped the land's own, people continued to define themselves by kinship, stool lineage, and ancestral law, their sense of boundary still spiritual, not geometric. Inland, the Ashanti Confederacy was taking form. From the sacred city of Kumasi, the golden stool was raised not as a symbol of tyranny but as a living covenant. Osei Tutu, with the council of the priest Okomfo Anoki, united fractious states into one of Africa's most sophisticated political systems. The Ashanti understood the delicate balance between might and legitimacy. Every conquest was sanctified, every ruler bound by ritual oaths. The empire's roads were marvels of order and communication, linking towns through carefully maintained paths where trade, justice, and ritual flowed together. These roads became more than transport routes. They were lines of cultural DNA, connecting people of varied origins, languages, and beliefs. The migrations that had once scattered communities now wove them together into a vast living organism. Across centuries, the genes of warriors, traders, and artisans mingled, creating the diverse tapestry that modern science would one day trace in mitochondrial strands. The people of Ghana, though divided by dialect or kingdom, were already one biological mosaic, a truth their ancestors lived long before genetics gave it a name. European influence deepened like a spreading shadow, forts multiplied, and trade shifted from gold to flesh. The transatlantic slave trade tore through the coastal kingdoms like a storm, distorting alliances and turning wealth into weaponry. Denkyera fell to Ashantimight, coastal clans rose and fell under foreign manipulation. Maps drawn in Lisbon, London, and Amsterdam began to shape political destinies inland. Maps that claimed ownership of lands never seen, drawn by hands that mistook rivers for borders and hills for walls. These early maps were less tools of navigation and more instruments of power, a prelude to the colonial partition yet to come. And still, beneath the turmoil, the people endured. They redefined survival as adaptation, trading not just goods but knowledge. Women became silent diplomats, arranging marriages across clans to maintain fragile peace. Oral historians continued to chant lineages so that no foreign tongue could erase memory. The land's own cartographers, the priests, traders, and elders, held in their minds the real geography of belonging, a mental atlas untouched by ink. By the late 18th century, the map of this region was a patchwork of ambition. The Ashanti Empire controlled vast inland territories, the Fant states negotiated along the coast, and the Europeans, though still confined to their forts, began to dream of dominion. The maps they produced showed neat divisions, yet on the ground, reality refused to obey those lines. A farmer's field could belong to multiple lineages, a shrine could be claimed by two kingdoms, and the forest itself often answered to none. The land defied cartography because it was defined not by ownership but by memory. As guns replaced spears and ships multiplied, the equilibrium of centuries tilted. The stage was being set for transformation that would redraw not only territory but identity. The boundaries drawn by colonial powers were still decades away, but their idea had already been born. The concept that land could be measured, divided, and owned like property was seeping slowly into the consciousness of a people who had always believed that Earth was ancestral and eternal. And so, as the kingdoms of gold glowed with their final splendor, they stood unknowingly at the edge of a new epoch, one where maps would lie, where bloodlines would scatter, and where the very definition of Ghana would be rewritten by distant pens. Yet, within the soil, the gold still gleamed, silent and eternal, as if to remind the world that the true wealth of this land could never be contained within borders or bought with power. Part 3. Lines of Power, the colonial carving of Ghana's map. When the European empires turned their eyes inward toward Africa, they did not see kingdoms, shrines, or histories. They saw empty space waiting for possession. To them, the land was a blank canvas, a silent page to be divided, named, and ruled. But Ghana's land was never blank. Every river, every forest clearing, every rock bore the stories of clans, the names of spirits, and the echoes of centuries of migration. Still, in the age of maps and empire, these sacred geographies were erased beneath ink lines and foreign flags. The late 19th century brought with it the fever of imperial ambition. Britain, France, Germany, and others rushed to stake their claims in Africa, carving territories in a conference room thousands of miles away. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 formalized this madness, dividing the continent with rulers and compasses, its delegates speaking of trade and civilization while their pencils mutilated ancestral worlds. For Ghana, the outcome would be profound. Its lands would be measured, not by lineage but by longitude. The British arrived on the Gold Coast with both arrogance and precision. Their maps, once drawn for trade, now became blueprints for control. They built forts into colonies, trade routes into supply lines, and alliances into instruments of subjugation. The Ashanti, proud and unyielding, resisted fiercely, their capital at Kumasi becoming a symbol of defiance against imperial intrusion. War followed war. The Anglo-Ashanti conflict spanning the 19th century became the fiery crucible that reshaped the region. Each victory and defeat altered not just power but geography. Kingdoms were annexed, borders redrawn, and new administrative divisions imposed. In 1896, the British finally occupied Kumasi. They exiled Asantehene Prempeh, breaking the symbolic backbone of the empire, yet the Ashanti spirit refused to die. The land mourned in silence as the golden stool, the sacred soul of the nation, was hidden to protect it from foreign desecration. When the British later demanded the stool, believing it to be a mere object of gold, the people rose once more under Yera Santwe, the Queen Mother of Ijesu, whose courage burned across history. Her rebellion in 1900 was not simply against colonial troops but against the very idea that spirit could be conquered. Even as resistance blazed, the British cartographers continued their quiet conquest. They surveyed rivers, measured roads, and charted boundaries as though the land were an object of geometry. In their maps, the ancient webs of connection that had once defined community were replaced with lines of control, administrative zones labeled Ashanti, Northern Territories, and Gold Coast Colony. These artificial divisions ignored centuries of migration and kinship. They cut across families, shrines, and trade networks with the cold indifference of empire. The people who had once traveled freely from forest to savanna now found themselves categorized, restricted, and renamed. Maps became weapons of legitimacy. A line on paper could justify occupation, taxation, or punishment. European cartographers, unfamiliar with a land's terrain or its languages, often relied on interpreters who mistranslated local names, embedding errors that still linger today. Rivers were renamed in foreign tongues, sacred mountains labeled as mere topographic features. What had once been a landscape of memory became an administrative grid. And yet, within these imposed boundaries, older identities refused to die. They lingered in the songs, in the markets, in the stories whispered under moonlight. By 1902, the British had formally annexed the Ashanti Kingdom, transforming the entire region into a protectorate under the name the Gold Coast. It was a title that revealed everything about their perspective. The land was valued for its resources, not its people. Mines dug deeper, roads and railways expanded to serve colonial extraction, and the natural wealth that had once sustained local prosperity now flowed outward to foreign capitals. But in the process, the very shape of modern Ghana began to take form. The arbitrary colonial borders would one day solidify into national boundaries, their permanence masking the centuries of violence and negotiation that birthed them. Yet, as history often reminds, oppression begets resilience. The people adapted, learned the language of their rulers, and began to turn the tools of empire against it. Educated elites emerged from mission schools, their pens as sharp as swords. They began to write, to question, to organize. Men like J.E. Casely Hayford, who spoke of self-government, and later Kwame Nkrumah, who envisioned Pan-African unity, so that the same maps used to divide could also be used to define freedom. A line drawn to separate could, with will, become a boundary of belonging. Still, the scars of colonial mapping ran deep. Villages split between colonies, ethnic groups divided by arbitrary frontiers, and trade networks disrupted by taxation and customs barriers. The old concept of shared landscape was fractured. But even then, the land itself seemed to resist. Rivers continued to flow across borders, families continued to intermarry, and traditions ignored the dictates of foreign law. The colonial map may have claimed ownership, but the earth never consented. By the early 20th century, the British had perfected their control not just through soldiers but through surveys. Maps were printed in London, each new edition a refinement of domination. Forest reserves were marked, towns catalogued, and mines numbered. Yet, beneath the precision of their cartography, the land retained its secret heart. The sacred groves remained unmapped, the ancestral shrines hidden in plain sight, the oral maps still guiding those who knew the old ways. Thus, by the dawn of the 20th century, the shape of modern Ghana was almost complete. The Ashanti heartland, the coastal Fant states, and the northern protectorates were now fused into a single colonial entity. But it was a union born of conquest, not consent. The lines of power that defined it would haunt generations to come, shaping politics, identity, and belonging long after the empire fell. And yet, within this imposed geography, something unexpected was happening. A new identity was forming, fragile but determined, an identity that saw through the illusion of empire and began to imagine unity beyond borders. The same people once divided by maps were starting to dream of a nation called Ghana, one that would reclaim not just its name but its meaning. A name that once symbolized gold and greatness would soon become a banner of liberation. But first, the people had to remember what the maps had made them forget. Part 4. The Rise of National Identity, Reclaiming the Land from Empire. Beneath the colonial map's rigid lines, a quiet revolution began to stir. It was not marked by armies or cannons, but by words, songs, and the restless energy of a people remembering who they were. The Gold Coast, as the British called it, had been reduced to a territory of mines and plantations, its rivers diverted for commerce and its hills scarred by rails of steel. But beneath this imposed order, the pulse of an older spirit still beat, the spirit of unity, of kinship, of a land that had always refused to be fully owned. The seeds of resistance were sown in classrooms, churches, and market squares. The colonial mission schools, designed to create obedient clerks and translators, had instead produced thinkers, young men and women who read both the Bible and the revolutionary writings of freedom movements abroad. They looked upon the map of the Gold Coast and saw not the divisions of tribe or province, but the absurdity of foreign control. Among them emerged voices that would reshape Africa's destiny. Men like J.B. Dankwa, Komla Agbalig Badima, and the fiery Kwame Nkrumah. Their vision transcended borders. They saw a Ghana reborn, not as a British possession, but as the spiritual heir of the ancient empires that once illuminated the continent. The early 20th century saw the rise of the Aborigines Rights Protection Society, one of the first organized movements to challenge colonial exploitation. Their battle began with land, the very soil that had been sold, taxed, and reclassified under British law. Chiefs and intellectuals joined hands to defend traditional ownership, arguing that the earth belonged not to governors but to ancestors and their descendants. This struggle was more than legal, it was existential. To lose the land was to lose identity itself. Through petitions, protests, and publications, the people began to draw their own countermap, one rooted not in imperial boundaries but in heritage. By the 1930s, the spirit of resistance had matured into a collective awakening. Workers on the docks of Sekondi and Takoradi whispered of independence, cocoa farmers in the hinterlands spoke of fairness, and students in Accra debated nationalism under the flickering glow of oil lamps. The colonial map that once symbolized control was becoming a rallying point. Every imposed border now marked an injustice to be undone. The Great Depression had exposed the fragility of empire, and the war that followed further weakened Britain's global hold. When World War II ended, the Gold Coast's veterans returned home not as subjects but as men who had fought for the freedom of others and now demanded their own. Kwame Nkrumah's arrival marked the turning of the tide. Educated in America and inspired by Pan-African thought, he returned with the conviction that Ghana could become the first truly independent black nation of the modern world. He saw beyond the colonial divisions and envisioned unity, a Ghana that would be both a restoration of history and a promise for the future. His words were thunder. His rallies became rivers of people. From Accra to Tamale, from Cape Coast to Kumasi, the nation began to awaken to its own name. The Convention People's Party, under his leadership, declared that self-government was not a distant dream but a birthright. The colonial administration, alarmed, tightened its grip. They redrew districts, censored newspapers, and imprisoned Nkrumah, but the movement had already outgrown control. The streets erupted in protest. Women traders, workers, and students took to the roads chanting freedom. The boundaries that had once separated tribes were dissolving under a shared hunger for liberation. The Gold Coast was transforming not just politically but spiritually. The imposed colonial geography was being overwritten by a new mental map, a map of belonging, of destiny reclaimed. On the night of March 6, 1957, the world watched as the Union Jack descended and a new flag rose over Accra, red for the blood of struggle, gold for the wealth of the land, green for its fertile promise, and the black star for Africa's freedom. Ghana was born, the first sub-Saharan African country to break free from colonial rule. Yet this birth was also a return, a resurrection of a name from the deep past, a deliberate reclamation of identity from the ancient Ghana Empire, whose glory had once illuminated West Africa centuries before. The new nation was not just a political entity, it was an idea, a rebuke to empire, and a reminder that Africa's history could never be fully erased by foreign ink. But independence brought its own challenges. The lines left by colonialism were not easily erased. Ethnic tensions, economic inequality, and inherited administrative divisions lingered like scars beneath the new nation's skin. Still, the dream endured. Nkrumah's call for Pan-African unity echoed across the continent, inspiring movements in Nigeria, Kenya, and beyond. Ghana became the torchbearer of black pride and continental freedom, its name spoken with reverence from Harlem to Addis Ababa. Yet, as the euphoria faded, the weight of governance began to reveal the depth of the colonial legacy. The British had left a map designed for control, not cohesion. Its borders enclosed diverse peoples with distinct histories. Its roads led outward to the ports, not inward to the people. The challenge now was not just political but psychological, to redraw, within the minds of its citizens, a sense of Ghanaian unity that transcended the inherited fractures of empire. And so, Ghana's post-independence years became a struggle of redefinition. Scholars began to explore oral traditions anew. Archaeologists unearthed forgotten sites, and educators restructured curricula to include the histories once silenced. The map of Ghana, once a colonial blueprint, slowly became a canvas of pride. Rivers, mountains, and towns regained their indigenous names, and local governance began to reflect traditional systems once dismissed as primitive by colonial rulers. The land was being reclaimed not by war but by memory. Still, beneath the celebration, questions lingered. Who truly were the Ghanaians? From what ancient mixtures did their bloodlines emerge? How far did their ancestry stretch beyond the artificial borders drawn by empires? As scholars and scientists began turning to genetics in the late 20th century, they found that the answers lay not only in history books but within the very DNA of the people themselves. And so, as the political struggle for independence gave way to the intellectual struggle for self-understanding, a new journey began, one that would not be fought on battlefields or in parliaments, but in laboratories, archives, and family trees, a journey to uncover how the land and its people were written in each other's code. The next chapter of Ghana's story would not be about drawing borders, but about dissolving them, through the revelations of ancestry, migration, and shared humanity. Part 5, Bloodlines of the Land, tracing Ghana's ancient genetic roots. Long before the science of genetics could name ancestry in strands and sequences, Ghana's people carried their history within them, in their skin, their songs, their tongues, and the stories that flowed through generations like river currents. When DNA testing finally entered the realm of African anthropology, it did not create identity. It merely illuminated what the ancestors had long known, that the people of Ghana are a living archive of migrations, unions, and survival stretching back tens of thousands of years. Each bloodline, like each river, told its own tale, yet together they wove the story of a nation whose diversity was its deepest truth. Genetic mapping across West Africa revealed patterns older than empire or even the earliest kingdoms. The first human footprints on this land were left by ancient hunter-gatherers, whose descendants still whisper through the mitochondrial DNA of modern Ghanaians. Around 12,000 years ago, as climates shifted and forests expanded, waves of new settlers arrived from the Sahara and the Nile Valley, carrying with them early languages and technologies that would seed the foundations of West African civilization. These were not invaders but wanderers following the call of water and fertile soil. Over millennia, their lineages merged with those already rooted in the land, creating the genetic core of Ghana's earliest peoples. The Great Bantu migrations added new layers to this heritage. Between 3000 BCE and 1000 CE, families and clans spread across the continent from Central and Eastern Africa, bringing ironwork, agriculture, and linguistic frameworks that still resonate in many of Ghana's dialects. Though the Akan and Yu languages belong to different branches of the Niger-Congo family, both carry echoes of these ancient movements, linguistic fossils of journeys across mountains, rivers, and time. These waves of migration shaped the ethnic and genetic diversity of the region, giving rise to the cultural mosaic that defines Ghana today. Modern genetics studies paint an intricate portrait of this mixture. The Akan, who formed the largest ethnic group, show deep ancestry tied to both forest-dwelling agriculturalists and northern Sahelian populations, evidence of trade and intermarriage across ancient routes long before colonial roads were ever built. The Yu of the Volta region trace threads of lineage eastward toward Togo and Benin, a living reminder that modern borders slice through what was once a single cultural continuum. In the north, the Mole Dagbani peoples carry markers linking them to ancient Sudanic and Mande populations, suggesting centuries of contact with the trade networks that once stretched to Timbuktu. The Ga and Adangbe of the coast reveal even older ties to populations that migrated from the east, their genes echoing the earliest coastal settlements shaped by fishing and trade. Yet, despite this diversity, the genetic tapestry of Ghanaians reveals an extraordinary interconnectedness. Studies show that across ethnic lines, the genetic variation within groups is far greater than between them. This scientific truth mirrors what elders have long taught in proverb and ritual, that all people are bound by the same ancestral clay. DNA, in its quiet objectivity, has confirmed what oral tradition proclaimed for centuries, that Ghana's people are not separate nations, but branches of one ancient tree. This revelation carries more than scientific weight. It is a reawakening of belonging. For centuries, colonial narratives had portrayed African societies as isolated tribes, divided and static. But the double helix tells another story of movement, adaptation, and shared survival. The so-called tribal boundaries that colonial powers inscribed were never biological or historical realities. They were inventions imposed upon an already interconnected landscape. The DNA of Ghanaians, like their history, refuses to obey those lines. Archaeological findings complement this genetic truth. Excavations in Bono Manso, Bago, and Daboya have unearthed remains that align with genetic data pointing to centuries of inter-regional contact. beads from North Africa, iron tools from the Niger Basin, and pottery styles from the Congo Basin all converge here, attesting to a long history of cultural and biological exchange. Even the ancient gold trade, often imagined as a purely economic system, was a human network that interwove bloodlines, traders married locally, their children embodying both north and south, desert and forest. The very trade that made Ghana rich also made it diverse. Modern technology has deepened these revelations. Whole genome sequencing has begun to map the microhistories of Ghana's regions, uncovering how centuries of migration from neighboring areas like Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, and Nigeria shaped its present population. These migrations were driven by shifting climates, wars, and opportunities, natural rhythms of human adaptation, not mere accidents of history. Each strand of DNA becomes a record of resilience, showing how communities blended and rebuilt in the face of droughts, invasions, and changing trade patterns. The land itself was a crossroads, and its people are the living proof. The African diaspora has also begun to turn its gaze back to Ghana's genetic map. In recent years, African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans tracing their ancestry through DNA tests have discovered familial connections to Ghanaian lineages, particularly among the Akan and Gara Dangbe. For many, this revelation has been more than scientific, it is spiritual. A return through blood to a homeland once lost through the brutal disruptions of slavery. The Ghanaian government, recognizing this profound link, has embraced such discoveries through initiatives like Year of Return and citizenship pathways for diasporans, blending modern science with ancestral healing. In this way, DNA has become both microscope and mirror, revealing shared humanity across centuries and continents. Still, as these discoveries unfold, they also challenge simplistic notions of identity. Ghana is not a mosaic of isolated ethnicities nor singular genetic story. It is an ever-evolving organism, shaped by countless crossings, marriages, and cultural fusions. The genome tells us that no one group can claim to be pure or original, that such ideas belong not to science but to colonial fantasy. In truth, purity was never the goal of the ancestors. Survival, harmony, and balance were, and in that ancient wisdom lies the foundation of Ghana's enduring strength. Thus, as science peers into the double helix, it finds what history had long hidden under maps and myths, that Ghana's story is one of convergence, not separation, of rivers that meet, not mountains that divide. The borders drawn by empires crumble before the timeless truth written in the blood of its people. And so, the next chapter in Ghana's narrative will move beyond ancestry into understanding, exploring how the land, shaped by centuries of movement, now reclaims its unity through culture, identity, and the science that finally affirms what the heart has always known. Part 6. The Map Redrawn, Reclaiming Space Through History and Heritage. When modern Ghana emerged on the map in 1957, its borders were already lines of compromise, drawn by others, named by others, and justified by treaties that seldom considered the voices of those who live within them. Yet, in the decades that followed, a slow reclamation began, not through conquest or rebellion, but through knowledge, culture, and the rediscovery of ancestral truth. The map that had once been a colonial tool of separation began to transform into a canvas of unity, and, with each generation, Ghanaians redrew their boundaries, not on paper, but in the spirit of identity and belonging. The first act of redrawing began with language. For centuries, colonial cartographers had renamed rivers, towns, and entire regions in ways that erased indigenous meaning. But after independence, Ghana sought to restore the soul of its geography by reasserting local names. Rivers like the Pra, Ankobra, and Tano regained their ancient status, no longer dismissed as mere tributaries but recognized as sacred arteries of civilization. Towns reclaimed their heritage through the revival of oral traditions and toponyms, reconnecting people to the stories of their ancestors that had been suppressed by foreign rule. This linguistic reclamation was not mere nostalgia. It was a declaration of ownership over both past and future. The second act unfolded through education. Ghana's early post-colonial leaders, particularly Kwame Nkrumah, understood that to truly redraw a nation, one had to rewrite its memory. Schools and universities became the laboratories of identity, revisiting history from an African perspective rather than a European gaze. Maps that had once depicted Ghana as a fragment of British West Africa were replaced with those that emphasized pre-colonial trade routes, indigenous kingdoms, and networks of cultural exchange. The blackboard became a battlefield where Ghana reclaimed its position as a center of historical gravity in West Africa, not a peripheral outpost of empire. This intellectual awakening resonated deeply with archaeology and anthropology. Excavations across the country began to uncover cities and settlements far older than colonial records acknowledged. The rediscovery of ancient trading centers such as Bago, Bono Manso, and Daboya revealed that Ghana's spatial history was not static but dynamic, shaped by centuries of human adaptation and ingenuity. Each unearthed artifact, from gold weights to pottery shards, redrew invisible lines on the mental map of Ghana, connecting north and south, coast and savanna, past and present. These findings didn't just expand historical knowledge, they restored dignity to forgotten civilizations erased by the simplicity of European maps. Modern mapping technology brought a new dimension to this reclamation. With satellite imagery, GIS tools, and drone surveying, Ghanaian scholars and environmental planners began to reinterpret the land not through colonial cartographic distortions, but through the lens of sustainability and cultural continuity. Forest reserves, for instance, were no longer seen merely as natural resources but as ancestral domains tied to clan histories and spiritual heritage. The sacred groves of the Akan and the stone shrines of the U were plotted into national mapping systems, blurring the artificial line between heritage and environment. The digital age allowed Ghana to reassert what colonial maps had ignored, that the land itself is an archive, each hill and river inscribed with human memory. But the redrawing of Ghana's map was not just geographical, it was also psychological and cultural. The boundaries left behind by colonialism had not only divided land but also fragmented identity, creating the illusion that tribes, languages, and religions were natural enemies. Yet, as DNA research and cultural dialogue deepened, Ghanaians began to see the map differently, as a shared inheritance rather than a contested space. Festivals, trade, and intermarriage blurred the borders. Drawn in ink, proving that the true nation existed not in territory but in connection. Through art, music, and literature, a new national narrative emerged, one that transcended the lines of division and celebrated multiplicity as strength. This cultural redrawing was visible in Ghana's cities, particularly in Accra. Once a colonial administrative hub, it became a living map of coexistence, where Gar fishermen, U traders, and Akan artisans mingled in markets that defied ethnic geography. Osu Castle, once a symbol of European dominance, was recontextualized as a museum of resilience, a physical reminder that the people who suffered within its walls had ultimately inherited the land beyond them. Urban planning itself began to mirror this inclusive vision, with cultural centers and heritage sites integrating traditional design with modern functionality. In doing so, Ghana's cities became maps of memory, each street and monument a reminder of how history could be reimagined rather than erased. Religion, too, played its part in reshaping space and identity. The syncretic blending of Christianity, Islam, and indigenous belief systems revealed that spiritual borders were far more porous than political ones. In many towns, shrines stood near mosques, and churches echoed with rhythms rooted in traditional drumming. This coexistence was not accidental. It was the continuation of an ancient tolerance that predated colonial influence. Ghana's map of faith, when viewed through this lens, was not one of division but of harmony, each belief system adding color to the same spiritual landscape. The map's redrawing also extended beyond Ghana's borders. The nation's diplomatic and cultural outreach to the African diaspora reframed the Atlantic not as a barrier, but as a bridge. Through initiatives like the Year of Return, Ghana invited descendants of the enslaved back to ancestral soil, redrawing the map of belonging to include millions whose ancestors had been torn away centuries earlier. The coastal forts of Elmina and Cape Coast, once prisons of despair, were transformed into places of pilgrimage and remembrance. The same structures that had symbolized captivity now became anchors of identity, linking Africa and its diaspora in shared healing. Yet, perhaps the most profound redrawing occurs in the minds of young Ghanaians. As they learn to navigate both physical and digital maps, they see their country not as a colonial relic but as a living organism, evolving with every innovation and discovery. The new cartographers are not explorers with compasses but data scientists, historians, and artists who use technology to tell stories their ancestors began. Through virtual heritage maps, cultural archives, and DNA-driven ancestry platforms, they weave together threads of land and lineage in ways no empire could have imagined. Thus, the redrawn map of Ghana is not defined by borders or treaties but by truth. It is the story of a people who turned imposed lines into symbols of resilience, who refused to let geography dictate destiny. Each generation adds a stroke, a voice, a discovery, reshaping not only the contours of a land but the meaning of nationhood itself. And so, as Ghana continues to evolve, its map stands as both record and promise, a testament to the power of reclamation and the courage of a people who dared to define themselves. Part 7, Empire and Memory, the kingdoms that shaped Ghana's heart. Long before the British and their maps, before the compass of the Portuguese traced the West African coast, the land that would become Ghana was already a constellation of kingdoms. Powerful, complex societies rose and fell across its forests, savannas, and coasts, each leaving behind layers of governance, trade, and belief that would one day define the spirit of a modern nation. These empires were not mere footnotes to European exploration, they were engines of civilization whose memory still pulsed through Ghana's culture, language, and lineage. The story begins with the Ouagadougou Empire, known to history as the Ancient Ghana Empire, though its heart lay north of present-day Ghana. Its name, borrowed by the British centuries later, became the title for the new nation, a symbolic bridge between medieval grandeur and post-colonial rebirth. Ouagadougou's kings commanded vast gold mines and controlled trade routes that linked the Sahara to the Atlantic. The empire's name carried such prestige that it outlived its geography, migrating southward through legend and trade, eventually echoing in the oral traditions of the Akan and Mole Dagbani peoples. The title Ghana, meaning warrior king, thus became both memory and prophecy. As Ouagadougou's influence waned around the 13th century, waves of migration reshaped the land. The Mande traders, the Wangara gold merchants, and warrior groups from the Sahel moved southward, carrying Islam, metallurgy, and trade systems that enriched the forest regions. The Bono state, in what is now Brong-Ahafo, emerged as one of the earliest Akan polities, its cities of Bono, Manso, and Bago serving as crossroads of northern and southern exchange. Archaeologists have uncovered glass, beads, cowries, and metalwork there that attest to centuries of thriving commerce long before European arrival. Through these centers, the genetic and cultural DNA of Ghana's future people began to fuse. The Akan states would later dominate much of what became central and southern Ghana. From Denkyera to Akwamu, from Akium to Asante, each kingdom developed intricate systems of governance marked by balance and consultation. The Akan model of leadership, rooted in the Golden Stool and the matrilineal inheritance system, wove together divine authority with social consensus. Chiefs and queen mothers shared power, a form of co-leadership that ensured accountability and preserved communal harmony. This balance between might and wisdom became one of the most enduring features of Ghanaian political philosophy. Among these kingdoms, none shone brighter than the Asante Empire. Founded in the late 17th century under Osei Tutu and the spiritual guidance of Okomfo Anoki, Asante united rival Akan states into a formidable confederation. The creation of the Golden Stool symbolized more than kingship, it represented the soul of the nation itself. Through centralized administration, a disciplined army, and a network of alliances, Asante expanded its influence across vast territories, from the Volta to the Ivory Coast. Its wealth came not only from gold but from its control of trade routes linking the interior to the coast, where European merchants eagerly awaited goods they could never produce themselves. The Asante Empire stood as a symbol of African statecraft and defiance. Its resistance to British encroachment during the 19th century, especially under leaders like Prempeh I and Yera Santwe, became a defining chapter in Ghana's historical memory. When Yera Santwe led the War of the Golden Stool in 1900, she transformed from queen mother to national icon, embodying the spirit of resistance that would later fuel Ghana's independence struggle. The Asante did not merely fight for territory, they fought for dignity, for the right to define their own history. To the east, the Yu peoples built equally sophisticated societies rooted in communal governance and sacred cosmology. Their migration from the Notsi kingdom in present-day Togo carried legends that continue to shape Yu identity. Towns such as Anlo and Kita grew into coastal strongholds of trade and culture, blending indigenous spirituality with the influences of European contact. Their storytelling traditions, music, and intricate social structures contributed to Ghana's cultural mosaic, proving that power was not only measured in armies and gold but also in art and wisdom. In the north, the Mole Dagbani states, including Dagban, Mamprugu, and Nanumba, carved out realms of diplomacy and resilience. Their founding myths speak of Eneg Bewa, the patriarch whose descendants spread across the savannah, establishing lineages that still guide chieftaincy today. These kingdoms became vital links between the Sahelian trade networks and the forest economies, controlling the movement of salt, leather, and cola nuts. Their hierarchical yet flexible governance systems reflected a unique synthesis of Islamic and traditional African institutions. They were not isolated tribes but essential participants in the regional web of commerce and culture. Meanwhile, along the coast, the Garadangbe established thriving settlements in the Accra Plains. Fishing, salt production, and trade with inland kingdoms defined their economy. Their society was structured around town councils and traditional authorities who maintained order through consensus rather than coercion. The Ga state of La and Osu developed into early urban centers that later absorbed European forts and became part of the colonial coastal architecture. Long before foreign colonizers arrived, these communities were already adept at managing diversity, navigating alliances, and integrating new technologies. Each of these kingdoms, though distinct, was bound by an invisible thread of exchange. Traders, intermarriages, and migrations wove their fates together into a single cultural fabric. Gold from the Akanlands reached markets in Dagbon, salt from the north flavored meals in Kumasi. Spiritual practices crossed rivers and languages, creating a shared moral universe. What colonial borders later divided, history had long united. Ghana's map, viewed through the lens of these empires, was never static. It was alive, shifting like the people themselves. As these kingdoms flourished, they also created systems of communication and record-keeping that challenged Western stereotypes of oral societies. The use of Akan gold weights, for instance, was not merely economic but symbolic, representing philosophical concepts like balance, justice, and reciprocity. The Adinkra symbols, still woven into cloth and architecture today, carried messages of wisdom and ethics. Even proverbs served as archives of governance, encoding the laws and values that structured daily life. These were not primitive systems but sophisticated modes of transmitting knowledge across generations. When the colonial era arrived, the memory of these kingdoms did not vanish. It went underground, carried in songs, ceremonies, and stories whispered through families. The map may have been redrawn by British rulers, but the mental geography of Ghanaians remained loyal to their ancestral domains. And when independence finally came centuries later, it was these empires, not the colonial governors, that provided the foundation for national pride and identity. Thus, the memory of empire is not a relic, it is a compass. It reminds Ghanaians that long before foreign flags were planted in their soil, their ancestors had already mastered the art of governance, the science of trade, and the philosophy of unity. In that knowledge lies the true power of Ghana's map, not the lines imposed from without, but the legacies drawn from within. Part 8. Colonial Cartography: How Empire Rewrote Ghana's Geography. When the European empires arrived on the West African coast, they did not see Ghana as a homeland of civilizations or cradle of kingdoms. They saw coastline, commodities, and coordinates. The European mind, trained in conquest and commerce, measured land not by lineage but by latitude. And so, with quill and compass, they began the slow and violent act of rewriting the geography of a people whose maps had always been drawn in story, trade, and ancestry rather than ink and conquest. It began with the Portuguese, who in 1471 reached the coast near Elmina and declared it a new frontier of Christendom and commerce. They named rivers, towns, and landmarks as if discovering them for the first time, erasing the names long spoken by the Fant, Ga, and Nzema peoples. Elmina Castle, built in 1482, became the first stone structure in sub-Saharan Africa built by Europeans, a symbol of permanence and possession. But this architecture of empire was not just physical. It was cartographic. Every fort and castle on the coast was a pin on a growing European map that claimed what could never rightfully belong to them. By the 17th century, rival European powers, the Dutch, the Danes, the Swedes, and the British, had transformed the coast into a checkerboard of flags and fortresses. Each constructed its own version of the map, redrawing boundaries with every treaty and war. The Dutch West India Company created maps that focused on trade routes, depicting the Gold Coast as a necklace of ports, each linked to the Atlantic slave trade. The Danish maps of Christiansborg and Osu emphasized the value of forts, rather than the people within them. To these empires, Africa was not geography but geometry, a space to be measured and divided for profit. What these maps omitted spoke louder than what they recorded. They ignored inland cities like Kumasi, Bono Manso, and Salaga, which had been centers of power for centuries, they left blank the intricate systems of governance, language, and kinship that structure the land. Instead, they marked the interior with the ominous label terra incognita, as though the people living there did not exist until drawn. To justify their expansion, they called these voids empty lands, and from that illusion of emptiness, they carved the borders that would later fracture entire nations. As European competition intensified, the maps became weapons. The Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1871 and later the Berlin Conference of 1884-85 formalized what had been a mercantile scramble into a political partition. At Berlin, European diplomats sat in ornate rooms thousands of miles from Africa and drew borders that ignored rivers, mountains, and ethnic landscapes. The Gold Coast, as Ghana was then called, was allotted to Britain with a ruler's stroke. The new map did not recognize the Asante Empire, the Dagban Kingdom, or the Ewe lands that extended into Togo. It recognized only European protectorates and colonies. The colonial cartographers thus transformed sovereign societies into administrative units, and their maps became instruments of erasure. The British imposed their own system of surveying and mapping, introducing grid coordinates and topographic charts. But beneath the veneer of scientific precision lay an ideology of control. By mapping every hill, road, and river, they made the land legible to the empire, to tax, to police, to exploit. Indigenous boundaries, which had been fluid and negotiated through kinship or ecology, were frozen into straight lines. The fluid mosaic of pre-colonial Ghana hardened into rigid districts and provinces, drawn to suit imperial efficiency rather than human reality. The Gold Coast Colony, the Ashanti Protectorate, and the Northern Territories were artificial creations that fragmented long-standing networks of trade and kinship. This cartographic violence also extended to the people themselves. Census records and administrative maps categorized Ghanaians by tribe, religion, and economic activity, introducing new hierarchies and divisions. The British constructed tribal maps that claimed to document the distribution of ethnic groups, but in doing so, they fossilized identities that had once been fluid. The Akan, Ewe, Ga, and Dagbani were no longer seen as interconnected peoples but as distinct administrative subjects. The map became a mirror of colonial ideology, one that presented African diversity as division and European control as order. Yet, even as empire drew its lines, resistance grew in the spaces between them. The Asante Wars were as much about geography as sovereignty, a battle to preserve indigenous borders from being overwritten. In 1896, when the British exiled Prempeh, they claimed victory, but the Asante never accepted the legitimacy of British maps. The land, to them, remained sacred and indivisible, no matter what lines were drawn upon it. In the north, resistance took quieter forms. Networks of trade and kinship continued to flow beneath the colonial gaze, defying imposed barriers. The irony of colonial cartography is that it sought to define a land it could never truly understand. The European mapmakers assumed that to measure was to know, but in Ghana, knowledge of the land was relational, not mechanical. It came from oral mapping, the knowledge of which rivers carried fish after the rains, which hills marked ancestral burials, which trees served as boundaries between clans. These indigenous maps were never static, they evolved with each generation, preserving harmony between people and place. The British replaced this living geography with printed charts and military surveys, but even their precision could not erase the emotional and spiritual topography that Ghanaians carried in their memory. After decades of colonial administration, by the early 20th century, the map of the Gold Coast had become one of the most detailed in British Africa. Roads, mines, plantations, and administrative boundaries sprawled across what had once been sacred space. Yet, the very act of mapping also sowed the seeds of rebellion. For when people could see how their land was divided, they began to question who had the right to draw those lines. Nationalists like J.B. Danquah and Kwame Nkrumah understood that independence required more than political freedom. It demanded the restoration of cartographic sovereignty. They envisioned a Ghana whose borders would not define limitation but liberation. When independence came in 1957, the colonial map remained, but its meaning changed. What had been a symbol of domination became a symbol of defiance. Nkrumah and his contemporaries retained the British-drawn borders but reinterpreted them through Pan-Africanism, seeing Ghana not as a fragment of empire but as the seed of continental unity. The map of Ghana thus became a paradox, a colonial inheritance transformed into a national emblem. Today, historians and geographers continue to peel back the layers of this colonial cartography. Digital reconstructions show how pre-colonial trade routes, ecological zones, and cultural regions were distorted or erased. By overlaying old European maps with modern data and indigenous knowledge, a new truth emerges that Ghana's geography, once fragmented by empire, is being redrawn by its people through research, heritage preservation, and cultural revival. The act of mapping, once a weapon of control, has become an instrument of reclamation. In this ongoing process, every road, river, and town regains its voice. The land, once silenced under foreign names, speaks again in its own languages. The map that once divided is now being healed, not by rulers or rulers' lines, but by those who remember that a nation's true boundaries are drawn not on paper but in the hearts of its people. Part 9. The Gold and the Coast, Trade, Transformation, and the Atlantic World. Long before the colonial boundaries hardened into law, the coast of Ghana had already become a theater of global desire. From its sands and estuaries flowed not only gold and ivory, but the currents of human ambition that would reshape continents. The very name Gold Coast, given by Europeans, reduced a living civilization to a commodity, yet beneath that label lay centuries of exchange, adaptation, and resistance. The story of Ghana's coast is the story of trade as transformation, a crucible where African enterprise met foreign greed and where humanity's brightest achievements coexisted with its darkest crimes. Centuries before Europeans arrived, the Akan peoples had already forged trade routes connecting the forested goldfields of the south to the Sahelian markets of the north. Gold dust, meticulously weighed with brass scales, traveled alongside kola nuts, salt, and cloth. These networks reached as far as Timbuktu, Jen, and Gao, making the Akan among the most sophisticated traders in pre-colonial Africa. The wealth they accumulated from this commerce allowed them to build stable kingdoms. Like Bono, Denkyera, and Asante, by the time the Portuguese first saw the glitter of Ghana's rivers in the 15th century, they were encountering not a primitive land but a thriving civilization already skilled in economic diplomacy. When the Portuguese established Elmina Castle in 1482, it marked the beginning of a new phase in this ancient system. They came seeking gold, but soon discovered a far more tragic commerce. The growing demand for enslaved labor in the Americas transformed West Africa's coastal trade into a human market. The coast became lined with fortresses, each bearing a flag from a different European nation but sharing a single purpose: to extract, to control, to profit. Elmina, Cape Coast, Christiansborg, and Anomabo became synonymous with both wealth and suffering. Their dungeons, dark and airless, became the antechambers of a global catastrophe. The trade networks that had once linked African societies in mutual exchange were now redirected to serve the transatlantic economy. Local rulers, merchants, and intermediaries were drawn into the web of European demand, trading captives for guns, textiles, and metal goods. The balance of power began to shift as coastal states grew wealthy while interior kingdoms suffered depopulation and disruption. The Asante Empire, with its centralized system and military strength, sought to control this trade on its own terms, regulating access to gold and people alike. But as the century turned, European manipulation and internal rivalries began to fragment these systems. The map of the coast changed again, not through diplomacy but through devastation. Yet, even within this system of coercion, agency persisted. African merchants such as the fat brokers learned to navigate the colonial economies to their advantage. They established powerful coastal confederacies, controlling harbors and setting prices in defiance of European monopolies. The fat states formed strategic alliances with both Asante and the British at different times, ensuring their survival through political flexibility. Women, too, played crucial roles in this mercantile world. Traders like Afua Sutherland's foremothers and the market queens of the coast managed extensive networks of distribution, often acting as cultural and economic intermediaries between Europeans and inland communities. Though history often recorded their male counterparts, the coastal trade was as much a matrilineal enterprise as it was a mercantile one. The gold that gave the region its name flowed out in vast quantities, but its value was never merely economic. In Akan cosmology, gold was a divine substance, symbolizing purity and life. It adorned stools, masks, and regalia not as decoration but as embodiments of spiritual authority. To see it melted down for coins and bars under foreign hands was a desecration, a theft of both wealth and meaning. Still, the Akan adapted, channeling their artistry into the creation of gold weights, miniature sculptures that preserve cultural identity even under colonial eyes. These weights, with their intricate patterns and proverbs, became a silent form of resistance, encoding wisdom in metal at a time when their creators were forbidden to write their own stories. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the Atlantic world tighten its grip on the coast. Britain emerged as the dominant power, displacing rival European nations through treaties and force. By the early 1800s, the British had effectively monopolized coastal trade, turning forts into administrative outposts. The abolition of the slave trade in 1807, though celebrated in Europe, did not immediately end the suffering. Illegal slave trading persisted for decades, and the shift toward palm oil and cocoa production simply replaced one form of exploitation with another. The people of the Gold Coast continued to labor under systems of coercion, even as they found new ways to resist them. Resistance took many forms. The Fant Confederation of 1868, for instance, was an early experiment in African self-governance, seeking to unite coastal states under local authority rather than British supervision. Though short-lived, it laid the groundwork for the later nationalist movements of the 20th century. The Asante, meanwhile, continued to assert their sovereignty through warfare and diplomacy, fighting multiple Anglo-Asante wars in defense of their independence. Each conflict was also a battle for economic control over trade routes, tariffs, and access to the coast. The struggle for the Gold Coast was never just about land, it was about the right to define the flow of wealth itself. As the 19th century drew to a close, the coast became increasingly Albanized. Towns like Accra, Cape Coast, and Sekondi expanded as centers of commerce, education, and activism. Mission schools taught literacy not merely as a colonial tool but as a means of empowerment. By the turn of the 20th century, a new class of educated Africans, lawyers, teachers, and journalists, emerged, forming the backbone of the nationalist movement. These men and women, descendants of traders and chiefs alike, began to reinterpret the map of their country, not as a coastline to be exploited, but as a homeland to be reclaimed. The coast, once a frontier of extraction, thus became a frontier of awakening. From its harbors and classrooms came voices that demanded autonomy and dignity. Figures like J.E. Casely Hayford, John Mensah Saba, and Kwame Nkrumah traced their intellectual roots to the coastal towns that had once been epicenters of foreign domination. They transformed the language of commerce into the rhetoric of liberation, turning the very networks that had once enslaved their ancestors into channels of resistance and unity. By the mid-20th century, as the Atlantic world shifted toward decolonization, the Gold Coast finally shed its imperial name and reclaimed one rooted in memory, Ghana. The new name did not merely honor the ancient empire of the North, it symbolized the restoration of dignity to a land that had endured centuries of exploitation. The coast that had once carried ships of bondage now welcomed vessels of freedom, carrying scholars, artists, and diasporic Africans returning home. The same waters that had borne pain now shimmered with promise. In this transformation lies the full circle of Ghana's coastal history. From gold to grief, from trade to transcendence, the coastline stands as both witness and participant in humanity's grand experiment. It is where the world first reached for Africa, and where Africa, centuries later, reached back. The tides that once carried loss now bring return, reminding all who stand upon those shores that maps can be redrawn, but memory endures. Part 10. The North Forgotten, Reclaiming Ghana's Overlooked Heritage. For centuries, the northern regions of Ghana lay at the heart of ancient trans-Saharan roots, pulsing with life, trade, and culture. Yet in modern maps and narratives, they often appeared as empty spaces. As colonial boundaries carved the land into artificial segments, the North was gradually marginalized, its once thriving centers reduced to footnotes in the story of a nation that now seemed to exist only along its coast. But long before the Gold Coast became a magnet for foreign powers, the lands of Dagban, Mamprugu, and Gonja had been centers of civilization, diplomacy, and migration, places where kingdoms rose not from gold but from wisdom, cattle, and kinship. The northern savannas of Ghana are vast and ancient, marked by open grasslands, seasonal rivers, and sacred groves that connect the living with their ancestors. It was here that the Dagomba, Mampruzi, and Nanumba peoples forged complex states, each led by our Na, a king whose authority derived from both lineage and spiritual mandate. Oral tradition speaks of Tohezi, the Red Hunter, an ancestral figure who migrated from the northeast, carrying with him both skill and legend. His descendants, according to law, founded the royal houses that still define northern political structures today. These were societies organized not around conquest, but around consensus and ritual. Power was less a matter of wealth and more a reflection of one's capacity to maintain harmony with the land and the spirits that guarded it. As the great empires of Mali and Songhai expanded westward between the 13th and 16th centuries, the northern territories became part of a greater Sahelian network. Salt caravans moved south from Tagaza and Tordini, exchanging slabs of white mineral for Ghanaian gold and kola nuts. In turn, northern merchants carried cowries, copper, and fine textiles to southern markets. These routes were arteries of communication and culture, introducing Islam, architecture, and literacy long before Europeans arrived on the coast. By the 14th century, Muslim scholars were teaching in towns like Salaga and Gambega, blending Quranic learning with indigenous wisdom. The region's history was thus never peripheral. It was the very link between West Africa's desert and forest civilizations. Yet when the European powers arrived, they saw the land differently. To them, the north was not a bridge but a barrier. Its distance from the sea made it economically inconvenient, its people less accessible to missionary education or colonial taxation. The British administration, based along the southern coast, effectively divided the country in both geography and policy. The Northern Territories were declared a protectorate rather than a colony, a bureaucratic distinction that meant fewer schools, fewer hospitals, and little investment. The British justified this neglect as preservation of traditional life, but in reality, it was economic exclusion disguised as cultural respect. The result was a legacy of disparity that continues to echo through the decades. Still, the northern peoples did not remain passive. They adapted to the new world on their own terms. Warriors became traders, chiefs became diplomats, and oral historians, or griots, became the guardians of identity. When colonial officers arrived with their measuring tapes and survey maps, they were often guided by local elders who already knew every boundary through memory and myth. To the colonial surveyors, the land was a set of coordinates. To its people, it was a living inheritance. The British drew straight lines where rivers bent and villages clustered, ignoring ancestral borders that had been negotiated through centuries of kinship. In doing so, they severed families and trade routes, leaving invisible wounds that no treaty could heal. The city of Salaga, once called the Timbuktu of the South, stood as a symbol of this lost grandeur. In its prime, it was a hub where Hausa, Mossi, and Gonja merchants met to trade slaves, salt, and livestock. The decline of the slave trade and the shift of commerce toward the coast caused its fortunes to fade, but its memory endures in song and story. Even in decline, Salaga remained a crossroads of cultures, a place where languages merged and identities were forged. The very DNA of northern Ghanaians reflects this diversity, bearing markers that trace back to ancient migrations from the Nile Valley, the Sahara, and the Niger Bend. Scientists studying mitochondrial and Y chromosome patterns have found genetic links that tie the northern peoples not only to their southern neighbors but also to distant Saharan tribes, proving that isolation was more political than biological. Indeed, modern genetic studies are now restoring the North's place in Ghana's national story. They reveal that the people of the savannah are not isolated remnants of forgotten tribes but the inheritors of a long continuum of movement and exchange. The Fulani, long regarded as nomads, left genetic imprints across the region, blending with Moldagbani and Gonja lineages. The Akan, too, show traces of northern ancestry, suggesting that migration flowed both ways over millennia. This means that Ghana's unity is not merely political, it is encoded in its very blood. What colonialism divided, DNA reunites. In the mid-20th century, as independence movements gained momentum, northern leaders like J.A. Brema and S.D. Dombo fought to ensure that their regions would not be left behind. They argued passionately that Ghana's identity was incomplete without recognition of the northern contribution. When Kwame Nkrumah envisioned a modern Ghana, he spoke of a nation united from the Volta to the Black Volta, implicitly invoking a wholeness that had long been denied. Schools were built, roads were paved, and efforts were made to integrate the North into national development, yet the structural inequalities of colonialism remained. The scars of neglect are slow to fade, but the memory of resilience runs deeper. Culturally, the northern regions have continued to influence Ghana's identity far beyond what the old maps suggest. The drum languages, dance rhythms, and oral poetry of the Moldagbani peoples have shaped the nation's music and storytelling traditions. The chieftaincy systems, with their emphasis on dialogue and spiritual legitimacy, remain vital to Ghana's governance today. Even the country's military and political history cannot be told without acknowledging the role of northern soldiers. whose discipline and courage have defined key moments in both colonial and post-colonial eras. The North, once marginalized, has emerged as a moral and cultural anchor, reminding the nation of its deeper, pre-colonial roots. In today's Ghana, as researchers combine historical archaeology with genomic data, the picture grows clearer. The supposed divide between North and South dissolves into a continuum of shared ancestry and mutual influence. Villages once dismissed as remote have yielded artifacts that show advanced metallurgy and trade links dating back 1,000 years. Linguistic studies trace the diffusion of words, crops, and technologies across ecological zones, demonstrating that ideas moved freely even when colonial borders did not. The more we uncover, the more it becomes evident that the North was never forgotten by history itself, only by those who chose not to look. Thus, reclaiming the story of Northern Ghana is not simply an act of regional pride. It is a restoration of balance, a correction of the map that confined human complexity to lines of convenience. The savannah, with its open skies and whispering grasses, holds in its soil the memory of a people who never ceased to move, trade, and create. When the wind passes through the baobab trees, it carries echoes of 1,000 journeys, converging into one enduring truth, that Ghana's strength has always lain in its diversity, and its map, however redrawn, will always trace the paths of its people. Part 11, Lines on Paper, How Cartographers Rewrote Ghana's Geography. When cartographers first set their instruments upon the lands that would become Ghana, they were not merely measuring distance or tracing rivers, they were reshaping perception. Each stroke of ink upon parchment translated landscapes of spirit, trade, and memory into grids of ownership. To those who lived on the land, the world was defined by sacred groves, ancestral shrines, and invisible boundaries shaped by kinship and custom. To the European mapmakers, however, it was a blank space awaiting definition, a canvas for imperial geometry. In this transformation, the rich fluidity of Ghana's landscape was flattened into fixed lines that would outlive their makers, imposing order where none was needed and confusion where harmony had long reigned. The earliest European maps of the region, drawn by Portuguese and Dutch explorers in the 15th and 16th centuries, were less representations of geography than declarations of presence. Names like Costa de Mina and El Mina were etched across the coast, marking places of gold and trade rather than communities of people. Rivers such as the Pra, Ancobra, and Volta were mismeasured and misplaced, their courses adjusted to fit maritime navigation rather than ecological truth. Inland, vast areas were labeled simply unknown or tribal lands, a silent admission of ignorance disguised as authority. The mapmakers of empire thus created a world that both concealed and justified conquest. For to name a place, in the language of empire, was to claim it. As European competition intensified in the 17th and 18th centuries, so too did the race to chart and possess the African coast. The British, Dutch, and Danes published detailed atlases, each depicting the Gold Coast in the image of their respective ambitions. The Danish cartographer Isaac sketched the coastline with military precision, marking forts like Christiansborg and Frederiksborg as civilized outposts amidst a native wilderness. The British cartographer James Rennell, working from incomplete reports and sailors' tales, constructed maps that imposed straight borders where rivers twisted through rainforest and savanna. In these maps, the coast was meticulously detailed, but the interior remained a blank expanse labeled with speculation, kingdoms misplaced, mountains invented, entire peoples omitted. Geography became propaganda, and maps became weapons. By the 19th century, as the scramble for Africa accelerated, these earlier sketches hardened into instruments of policy. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, European diplomats divided the continent using maps drawn in distant offices, guided by rumor more than reality. Ghana's territory, then part of the broader region known as the Gold Coast, was sliced and reshaped according to imperial compromise rather than indigenous geography. The British, claiming administrative control, extended their protectorate inland, absorbing diverse kingdoms and ethnic groups under a single colonial label. The northern savannas, the Akan forests, and the coastal plains were fused not by shared consent but by the convenience of a ruler's pen. What had once been fluid borders of culture became rigid boundaries of control. This process of cartographic conquest had devastating consequences for local societies. Entire communities found themselves suddenly separated from their trading partners or ancestral lands. The for example, was split between British, French, and German spheres of influence, their kin divided by invisible borders they never agreed upon. the Dagomba and Mamprusi kingdoms, once connected by fluid political alliances, were now treated as separate tribal units for administrative convenience. Even rivers, those ancient lifelines of connection, became boundaries rather than bridges. The Volta, which had once united communities through fishing and trade, was redrawn as a frontier between colonies. The map, once an art of exploration, had become a tool of fragmentation. Yet within this artificial order, resistance emerged. Ghanaian scholars, chiefs, and interpreters quickly recognized the power of the map and began to use it for their own purposes. By the early 20th century, local leaders were petitioning colonial authorities with hand-drawn maps that reasserted traditional land rights. In courtrooms from Kumasi to Tamale, elders unrolled parchment and traced borders not with compasses but with memory. They spoke of trees planted by ancestors, of stones marking sacred sites, of rivers that had defined territories long before colonial ink. These indigenous cartographies, rooted in oral history and environmental knowledge, stood as quiet defiance against the arrogance of European precision. The act of mapping became a battle for legitimacy. After independence in 1957, the newly formed Republic of Ghana faced a paradox. The map it inherited was both a prison and a promise. It carried the scars of imperial distortion, yet it also offered a blueprint for unity. Kwame Nkrumah, aware of the power of symbolism, refused to redraw the colonial map. Instead, he sought to redefine its meaning. Ghana's borders would no longer signify subjugation but solidarity. The flag, with its black star, became the new emblem of direction, a guidepost for Pan-Africanism, rather than European conquest. In his speeches, Nkrumah spoke of Ghana as a map of freedom, transforming the colonial artifact into a statement of identity. Nevertheless, the legacy of artificial boundaries continued to shape the country's internal dynamics. Regional tensions, land disputes, and cultural divisions often trace their roots to colonial cartography. The lines separating the northern and southern territories, once administrative, evolved into an economic divide. Even linguistic zones were skewed, as colonial administrators grouped diverse dialects under single labels. These distortions endure in school textbooks, census reports, and land records. To correct them requires not only new maps but new ways of seeing. In recent decades, Ghanaian historians and geographers have begun to reclaim the art of mapping. Projects such as the Savannah Heritage Mapping Initiative and the Ghana Spatial History Archive combine satellite imagery with oral traditions, revealing a geography that transcends colonial boundaries. Digital cartography now allows historians to layer archaeology, folklore, and DNA evidence upon the same map, showing the continuity of movement across centuries. In these new maps, trade routes long erased are reconnected, migration paths are redrawn, and forgotten settlements reappear from beneath the soil. The land, once silenced, begins to speak again. Perhaps the most revolutionary form of mapping, however, comes not from satellites but from genetics. DNA mapping has revealed migration routes that correspond uncannily with ancient trade paths, confirming what oral historians long maintained. The genetic overlap between northern Moldagbani peoples and southern Akan groups reflects millennia of intermarriage and shared ancestry. These discoveries challenge colonial narratives that portrayed Ghana as a mosaic of isolated tribes. Instead, they reveal a nation woven from continuous movement, where rivers, not rulers, define belonging. Thus, the true map of Ghana is not drawn in ink but carried in memory, song, and blood. It lives in the farmer who tills land his ancestors once walked without papers, in the fisher whose boat follows routes older than borders, and in the child whose DNA bears the echoes of migrations that predate empire. To correct history, one must first correct the map, and to correct the map, one must listen to the land. The lines on paper fade, but the stories they tried to contain endure, flowing endlessly like the Volta toward the sea. Part 12, The Fabric of Genes, Ghana's DNA and the Story Beneath the Skin. Long before borders were drawn and kingdoms rose and fell, the people who now call themselves Ghanaians carried within them an ancient code, a genetic memory older than any monument or manuscript. Beneath the skin, in the double helix of every Ghanaian life, lies the story of migrations, unions, and survival that transcends tribe and territory. DNA, once an invisible inheritance, has now become a language through which history speaks again, correcting the maps and myths imposed by empire. The fabric of Ghana's genes reveals not separation but connection, not purity but interweaving, for every strand tells of encounter, adaptation, and belonging that stretches deep into prehistory. Modern genetic studies, conducted by teams from the University of Ghana, the Wellcome Sanger Institute, and other global research centers, have begun to illuminate these buried lineages. When scientists sampled DNA from across Ghana's regions, from Moldagbani in the north to Akan in the south, from Gardangme along the coast to U in the east, they discovered a remarkable truth: that no single Ghanaian population is genetically isolated. Instead, all share overlapping ancestries, reflecting thousands of years of migration, intermarriage, and trade. The genetic gradients, when mapped, mirror ancient trade routes rather than colonial borders, proving that long before Britain or Portugal arrived, the land was already a network of moving peoples. The story begins deep in antiquity. Around 100,000 years ago, humans walked out of the African heartlands, but not all left. Many remained in what is now West Africa, their descendants adapting to diverse climates and ecosystems. Archaeological and genetic evidence suggests that some of these early groups settled along the Volta Basin, drawn by water and fertile soil. Their DNA, rich in genetic diversity, became the foundation upon which later migrations built. Modern West African populations, including Ghanaians, show among the highest levels of human genetic variation in the world, a testament to how long their ancestors have lived upon this land. Around 3,000 years ago, new migrations began to shape the genetic landscape. These included waves of Niger-Congo-speaking peoples moving south and west from the Sahel in search of arable land. They brought with them not only language but also ironworking, agriculture, and social systems that would form the backbone of later civilizations. The Akan, the largest ethno-linguistic group in modern Ghana, trace their distant ancestry to these movements. Their DNA bears signatures of both forest and savanna lineages, a biological reflection of their dual heritage as mediators between ecological worlds. Genetic markers associated with the Mande and Gur peoples are also found within Akan genomes, suggesting centuries of interconnection long before the first Europeans set foot on the coast. The Yu and Gardangme peoples, often described as coastal populations, likewise possess complex genetic tapestries. The Yu share ancestral components with groups from present-day Togo and Benin, consistent with oral histories describing migration from the east under pressure from rival kingdoms and spiritual signs. The Gardangme, established around the Accra Plains, carry genetic traces of both coastal and northern ancestry, a sign of their historical role as traders, fishermen, and intermediaries between hinterland and ocean. The Gwan, often considered Ghana's earliest inhabitants, appear as a genetic thread woven through many groups, linking the ancient forest settlers to later migrants. Their descendants, scattered from Yeji to Late, retain genetic fingerprints of the first Ghanaians, predating the rise of the Akan kingdoms. But DNA does not only record migration, it records contact. When the trans-Saharan trade flourished between the 9th and 16th centuries, it carried not just goods but genes. Berber and Arab merchants who journeyed south brought new lineages that subtly entered local populations through intermarriage and settlement. Genetic markers typical of North Africa and the Maghreb can still be found in small percentages within northern Ghanaian groups such as the Gonja and Dagomba. These traces are faint but telling, the human evidence of centuries of commerce and cultural exchange. Yet the influence was never one-directional, for as northern Ghanaians traveled northward with caravans, they too left their imprint on the Sahel, creating a two-way flow of ancestry that science now uncovers. When the Atlantic slave trade began, a darker kind of movement took hold. Millions were taken from the coasts and interiors of West Africa, including the Gold Coast. The genetic impact of this tragedy was global. Today, Ghanaian DNA can be traced not only across Africa but throughout the Americas and the Caribbean. Studies of African diasporic populations in Jamaica, Haiti, and Suriname reveal strong genetic affinities with Akan and Yu groups, confirming the historical records of forced migration. Yet in a poetic reversal, modern technology now allows descendants of those taken to trace their roots back to Ghana through DNA testing. The reunions, sometimes thousands of years delayed, testify to a resilience that transcends the violence of history. At the same time, the exchange was not entirely one-sided. As Europeans settled and intermarried along the coast, their genetic footprints also entered the Ghanaian gene pool. Small but measurable traces of European ancestry, particularly Portuguese and British, appear in the DNA of some coastal communities. These markers tell stories of negotiation, coercion, and survival. In Cape Coast, Elmina, and Anomabo, children born of mixed heritage became intermediaries, translators, and in some cases, power brokers between worlds. Though colonial history often reduced them to curiosities, their genes remind us of a more complex reality, that even within systems of domination, human connection persisted. Modern genetics has also illuminated adaptation. Ghanaians, like many West Africans, carry unique gene variants shaped by millennia of environmental challenge. Variants that confer resistance to malaria, for instance, such as the sickle cell trait, arose as evolutionary defenses against the mosquito-borne disease. Similarly, gene clusters related to lactose intolerance, skin pigmentation, and metabolism reflect both climate and diet. Each adaptation is a testament to resilience, an evolutionary dialogue between humanity and environment that has unfolded over tens of thousands of years. The genetic fabric of Ghana, then, is not just a record of ancestry but a chronicle of survival. What emerges from these studies is a profound truth. Ghana's identity is biological evidence of unity. No group stands apart. All are part of an unbroken continuum. The Moldagbani share threads with the Akan. The Yu and Gardangmi connect to both eastward neighbors and inland kin. Even across colonial borders, Ghanaian DNA blends seamlessly into that of Togo, Burkina Faso, and Côte d'Ivoire. The human body, it seems, ignores the lines drawn on maps. In recent years, Ghanaian scientists have embraced this revelation, using DNA to reclaim historical agency. The African Ancestry Genome Project, in collaboration with local communities, has made it possible for ordinary Ghanaians to participate in genetic research that redefines how identity is understood. By merging DNA results with oral histories and archaeological findings, these scholars are demonstrating that the Ghanaian story cannot be told through colonial texts alone. It must be read in the body itself. The implications extend beyond science. They speak to reconciliation, both national and global. When diasporic Africans return to Ghana through DNA ancestry tracing, as seen in the Year of Return initiative, they are not merely tourists, they are completing a historical circuit. The genetic kinship between modern Ghanaians and African Americans is no longer metaphorical but measurable, allowing new forms of belonging and dialogue to emerge. Thus, beneath the skin of every Ghanaian lies a living archive, one that speaks in the language of cells rather than ink. It tells of deserts crossed, forests settled, coasts navigated, and bloodlines intertwined. It defies the colonial myth of tribal isolation and replaces it with the biological truth of unity. To read Ghana's DNA is to rediscover a nation older than any empire and more interconnected than any border could contain. The body remembers what maps forget. Part 14. The DNA of Resistance, Ghanaian Identity in the Modern World. Ghana's modern identity, though dressed in the fabrics of independence and global recognition, still carries within its genetic code the quiet defiance of countless ancestors who refused to vanish beneath the shadow of foreign powers. When the country gained independence in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah's vision of self-determination, it became not only a political victory but a biological continuation of resistance embedded deep within the Ghanaian genome. Each region of Ghana, Ashanti, Yu, Ga, Dagomba, Fant, and others, retain traces of ancient migrations, matrilineal lineages, and adaptive traits that told stories of endurance against colonization, climate, and conquest. Modern DNA studies revealed that while the people of Ghana shared broad West African ancestry, they also contained fine threads linking them to early Saharan migrants, Nile Valley settlers, and even minor traces from the Levant, reminders of ancient exchanges before borders existed. This complexity defied simplistic national narratives. The idea of pure blood was meaningless when every Ghanaian carried the echoes of caravans, seafarers, warriors, and farmers intertwined by millennia of movement. Nkrumah's call for Pan-Africanism, in a sense, was a scientific truth long before political theory, a call to recognize shared ancestry beneath the surface of artificial divisions. Yet, while independence brought pride, it also brought a question that few dared to ask aloud: who were Ghanaians before the map was drawn? As universities in Accra and Cape Coast collaborated with geneticists across Africa, research began comparing DNA from ancient burials, such as those found near Comoland and Bono Manso, with present-day samples. The results astonished even the most seasoned historians. The genetic signatures of the earliest Iron Age farmers still pulsed within modern populations, showing that despite wars, slavery, and colonization, a profound continuity of life had persisted. The land itself seemed to have absorbed the identity of its people, shaping them through its rains, its forests, and its gold-laden rivers. This was not the survival of a single ethnicity but of shared rhythm, an unbroken biological dialogue between the Earth and its inhabitants. Ghana's resistance had not only been political but molecular, even in the diaspora, among Afro-Caribbeans and African Americans tracing their roots. DNA tests revealed a striking recurrence of Ghanaian ancestry. This connection reinvigorated diasporic movements and inspired cultural pilgrimages to places like Elmina Castle and Cape Coast, where descendants of the enslaved sought both reconciliation and recognition. The Ghanaian government, understanding the power of this genetic bridge, launched the Year of Return in 2019, inviting Africans across the world to reconnect with their ancestral homeland. For many visitors, it was more than tourism. It was spiritual archaeology, a homecoming to genetic memory. Scientists continued mapping mitochondrial and Y chromosomal variations, finding that while external influences from European or North African traders existed, they represented a mere fraction compared to the deep, indigenous West African roots. What emerged was an image of Ghana not as a static nation but as a living organism, an ancient and adaptable society that absorbed change without losing identity. The same DNA that once guided migrants along the Niger River now guided a modern people into a globalized age. Linguists, historians, and geneticists began to see the pattern. Every linguistic shift, every migration, every colonial boundary had left marks not just on maps but in chromosomes. And yet, the Ghanaian genome spoke of something even deeper: cooperation, exchange, and shared survival rather than domination. The people of Ghana were not a collage of conquered tribes but a symphony of converging stories. As education spread and technology improved, young Ghanaians began to view their ancestry not as an artifact but as a key to understanding modern challenges. In classrooms and online forums, students debated what it meant to be Ghanaian in a world of shifting identities and migration. They found answers in DNA charts and family oral histories, connecting the threads between science and soul. Museums began integrating genetic data into exhibitions, showing visitors not just ancient tools or pottery but the biological journeys of the people who made them. This transformed Ghana's narrative from one of imposed colonial definitions to one of biological self-authorship. The once rigid borders on paper maps seemed to blur against the fluid motion of genes, migrations, and cultural continuity. Through this fusion of history and biology, Ghana's story became one of survival and synthesis, a tale written not only in ink and stone but in the invisible code that defines all human life. As scholars traced haplogroups and mitochondrial lineages across the Sahel and the Gulf of Guinea, they realized Ghana's role in the human story was far greater than colonial maps suggested. It was a cradle of ancient innovation, spiritual diversity, and resilient adaptation. The DNA of its people bore witness to kingdoms that rose and fell, to captives who returned in new forms, to strangers who became kin. In every bloodline lay a chronicle of triumphs and trials written in the language of evolution. And as the 21st century unfolded, Ghana's map, once drawn by outsiders, was being redrawn from within, not by lines of ink, but by the living truth of its people's genetic inheritance. Part 15, The Living Map, Redefining Ghana's Future Through Science and Memory. In the modern era, as satellites chart the contours of continents and drones scan the Earth in microscopic detail, Ghana's map stands no longer as a colonial artifact but as a living manuscript rewritten by science, culture, and consciousness. The once static borders that European cartographers etched with ink and authority have become porous in the light of digital technology, migration, and genetic revelation. In universities, data scientists and anthropologists collaborate to layer DNA maps over historical trade routes, tracing how people once moved along the Volta Basin and the Gulf of Guinea. What emerges is not a single line of ancestry but a network of interwoven migrations, a tapestry shimmering with the shared history of thousands of communities that have coexisted, blended, and transformed. The story of Ghana, once constrained by colonial boundaries, now unfolds as a molecular narrative of resilience. In Accra, the National Museum's new exhibit titled The Living Map draws crowds of students, elders, and diasporic visitors. Inside, walls of glass display holographic projections of Ghana's evolving borders through time, from the prehistoric settlements of Bonomanso and Kintampo to the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, to the colonial scramble that divided a continent without its consent. Each shift in the display pulses with colors representing human migrations, genetic flows, and cultural exchanges. A child gazes up, pointing at a glowing thread labeled U Akan Connection, asking her mother if they are part of it. and the woman smiles softly, whispering that every Ghanaian is. This visual fusion of history and biology challenges the myths of isolation that once defined national identity. Scholars now understand that no people exist as isolated islands of blood or culture. Rather, they are rivers converging and separating, always in motion. DNA has given Ghanaians a mirror not of purity, but of unity through diversity. The Ashanti and Fant, once separated by dialect and politics, now share genetic markers that prove their ancestral proximity. The Yu of the Southeast and the people of Togo and Benin share deep maternal lineages dating back thousands of years, suggesting that the idea of foreign was an illusion crafted by European geography. Modern Ghana embraces this realization with pride rather than fear. Genetic literacy becomes part of civic education, with schools teaching not just geography and history but the biological story of humanity. Students learn that their blood carries the echoes of the first farmers of the Sahel, the salt traders of the Sahara, and the voyagers of the Atlantic. They learn that their ancestors were not passive recipients of history but active participants who shaped trade, technology, and governance long before the first European ship appeared on the horizon. In this new light, Ghana's borders are seen not as limits but as thresholds of memory. The Volta River, once a boundary of empires, now becomes a symbol of flow and connection. The coastline, once a site of captivity, now transforms into a space of return and reconciliation, where descendants of the diaspora arrive to walk upon the same soil their forebears were taken from. Scientists, too, play a role in this reawakening. Through projects like the African Genome Initiative, Ghanaian researchers are sequencing local DNA not for foreign profit but for local empowerment. They seek to understand hereditary diseases, genetic adaptations to tropical climates, and the ancient immunities shaped by millennia of environmental change. Yet beyond medicine, the project has philosophical weight. It reminds a nation that knowing one's DNA is not surrendering to determinism, but reclaiming authorship over identity. The Ghanaian genome, after centuries of being trafficked, classified, and exploited, finally speaks in its own language. The laboratories of Kumasi and Accra become new temples of memory, where microscopes replace colonial maps and data replaces decrees. Historians integrate this biological knowledge with archaeology, creating a unified chronicle that redefines what it means to belong. The modern Ghanaian, armed with both science and story, stands as heir to one of the most continuous human histories on Earth. And as global conversations about ancestry and belonging intensify, Ghana becomes a beacon of how nations can balance modernity with memory. The map of Ghana, once drawn by others, now glows on digital screens in classrooms and homes, reshaped by its own people. It shows not rigid lines, but living veins of migration and kinship, extending into Côte d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, and beyond. Every pixel tells a story of survival. The Atlantic coast hums with ancestral resonance, not of chains, but of continuity. In the evenings, when the sun dips below the horizon of Cape Coast, waves crash against the same stones that once witnessed the darkest chapters of human displacement, and yet those waters now reflect a different truth, that the people who were taken are returning in spirit through knowledge, remembrance, and reconnect ion. Ghana's map breathes anew. It is no longer a product of empire but a portrait of evolution, drawn not with rulers and compasses but with genes, dreams, and the unyielding will of a people to define themselves. And so, the story comes full circle, not as an ending, but as a reawakening, where every Ghanaian heart beats in rhythm with the ancestral drum of time, proclaiming to the world that history, when corrected, does not divide, but heals. Thank you for exploring Ghana's powerful story of origins and resilience. From shifting empires to living DNA, we've uncovered how science and memory converge to rewrite history. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this journey of rediscovery, because truth, once found, belongs to everyone.